The rain pattered against my office window, a rhythmic tattoo that didn't do much to drown out the silence. I'd been nursing my third cup of coffee, its warmth cutting through the chill creeping into the room. Business had been slow as usual. Missing pets, cheating spouses, the occasional lost heirloom. Hardly enough to make rent, let alone keep me entertained. That's when she walked in. Mrs. Edith Warren. She wasn't like the usual clients, desperate parents or jittery spouses. No, Edith carried herself with an odd dignity, even if her wrinkled hands trembled as she clutched a weathered leather handbag. Her eyes, sharp but shadowed with worry, told me she wasn't here on a whim. "Mr. Harper," she began, her voice thin but steady, "I need your help finding my granddaughter, Sarah." I gestured to the chair across from my desk, and she sat down slowly, her movements betraying her age. "The police are handling missing persons now," I said, though not unkindly. It was a reflex, one I regretted almost immediately. I've seen enough cold cases to know that sometimes people turn to someone like me because the system has already turned its back. "They don't believe me," she replied, her voice tightening. "They think she ran away, but she didn't. She wouldn't. Not without her lantern." I raised an eyebrow. "Lantern?" Edith opened her bag and pulled out a small, faded photograph. It was an old Polaroid, the kind that looked as fragile as the memory it held. In it, a young girl, late teens I guessed, stood smiling in a patch of sunlight, holding an antique lantern. The lantern looked out of place, as if it belonged in a Victorian novel instead of a teenager's hands. "That's Sarah," Edith said, her voice softening. "And that lantern belonged to her mother. To me. And my mother before that." "You think she was taken?" I asked, studying the photo. She nodded. "Something took her." Her words gave me pause. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed the bridge of my nose. People say a lot of strange things when they're grieving. Sometimes they need a villain to fight when the real one is just the cold indifference of life. "Mrs. Warren," I began. "I don't mean to be insensitive, but sometimes it's cursed," she interrupted. I blinked. "The lantern?" "Yes," she said firmly. "It's cursed. It's been in my family for generations, and every time someone strays too close to it, something awful happens. Deaths, disappearances, accidents that can't be explained." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I studied her. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes carried a peculiar intensity. She wasn't just grieving. She was scared. Still, curses weren't exactly my thing. I deal in reality, or at least whatever reality I can hold in my hands. "Mrs. Warren," I said carefully, "I don't deal in the supernatural. What I can do is look into Sarah's disappearance. But if you want an exorcist or a priest, you're better off looking elsewhere." Her gaze didn't waver. "I'm looking for someone who doesn't dismiss the impossible outright. Someone who can look where others refuse to. Touché." She slid the photo across the desk. My fingers hovered over it for a moment before I picked it up. That's when it happened. The air in the room grew colder. Just a fraction, but enough to make the hair on my arms stand on end. A faint whisper tickled the edge of my hearing, so soft I couldn't make out the words. And then there was the chill, sharp and sudden, cutting through the warmth of my coffee like a blade. I blinked, and the moment passed. The room was warm again, the whispers gone. But the sensation lingered like an aftertaste, and my gut twisted with a familiar unease. I set the photo down and met her gaze. "Tell me everything," I said. She explained how Sarah had vanished 2 weeks ago. No signs of a struggle, no note, nothing. Just gone. The police had shrugged it off as a runaway, just another teenager fed up with small-town life. But Edith was adamant. Sarah was happy, grounded, and would never leave without the lantern. "You really believe it's cursed?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. She hesitated before nodding. "I've seen what it does, Mr. Harper. It's like it has a mind of its own. It calls to people, and once they touch it, it doesn't let go." I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. Instead, I tapped my pen against the desk and studied her again. There was something raw about her fear, something that didn't feel like fiction. "Fine," I said. I'll take the case. But I need access to Sarah's belongings, her room, her things. And I'll need to ask some questions around town. She nodded eagerly. Anything you need. As she left, I glanced down at the photo again. Sarah's smile was bright, her grip on the lantern casual. But now, all I could see was the shadow of something lurking behind the glass. Faint but there. My sixth sense whispered to me again, that nagging pull at the edge of my consciousness. I lit a cigarette, leaned back in my chair, and exhaled slowly. Something told me this wasn't just another runaway case. And as much as I hated to admit it, I wasn't sure if that lantern was cursed. But I knew one thing. It wasn't ordinary. Meadow Creek wasn't on most maps, and it didn't look like much when I got there. The kind of place where every building had seen better days, and the streets felt weighed down by some invisible force, as if the town itself was holding its breath. It was late afternoon when I pulled in, the sun struggling to shine through a blanket of gray clouds. Sarah lived here, or at least she did until she didn't. The main street was lined with mom-and-pop shops, half of them closed or boarded up. A gas station, a thrift store, and a single cafe that looked like it doubled as the town's social hub. That's where I started. Inside, the air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and grease, and the hum of a conversation cut off as soon as I walked through the door. A dozen pairs of eyes turned my way, suspicious, guarded, like they knew I didn't belong. I wasn't expecting a welcome party, but the tension in the room felt heavier than usual small-town nosiness. I took a seat at the counter, ordered a black coffee, and ignored the stares. The waitress, a woman in her late 50s with a no-nonsense attitude, poured my drink without a word. Her name tag read Nancy. "You passing through, or you looking for something?" she asked, breaking the silence. Her tone was polite enough, but there was an edge to it, like she already knew the answer and didn't like it. "I'm a private investigator," I said. "Hear about Sarah Warren." The reaction was subtle, but it was there. The corners of her mouth tightened, and her hand paused for a split second as she reached for the coffee pot. Behind me, I heard the low murmur of conversation pick up again, hushed and hurried, like they didn't want me to catch a word. "Shame about that," Nancy said, not meeting my eyes. "You know her?" "Not well. Nice kid. Quiet. Kept to herself mostly." She didn't sound convincing. I sipped my coffee, pretending to savor the bitter taste while I studied her. "Any idea where she might have gone?" "Nope." She turned away, busying herself with wiping down the counter, and that was that. No follow-up, no small talk. The rest of the cafe wasn't much better. People avoided my gaze, and every question I asked was met with half answers or awkward deflections. It was clear the town didn't want me digging too deep, but if they thought that would scare me off, they didn't know me very well. The breakthrough came when I wasn't trying. As I paid my tab, two men at a corner booth muttered something that caught my attention. "The lantern," one said, his voice low and wary. "Shouldn't have gone to the woods," the other replied. The words pricked at my ears like needles. I didn't turn around, didn't let on that I'd heard. Instead, I pocketed my change, thanked Nancy, and walked out. The motel on the edge of town was the kind of place you stayed if you didn't have a choice. The neon vacancy sign buzzed and flickered, casting a sickly red glow across the cracked asphalt. The clerk at the front desk barely looked up from his magazine as he handed me the key, mumbling something about no smoking and don't mind the noise. The room was worse than I expected. Peeling wallpaper, a lumpy mattress, and a faint smell of mildew. But it wasn't the worst place I'd stayed in. Not by a long shot. That first night, I sat at the rickety desk with my notebook open, piecing together what little I had. Sarah's room back at Edith's place had been clean, but not untouched. I'd spotted a symbol carved into the corner of her desk. A small, crude design like a circle with jagged lines radiating out from the center. At the time, I'd copied it into my notebook, thinking it was just a doodle. Now, though, something about it nagged at me, like I'd seen it before. I flipped back to the page and studied it under the dim light. It wasn't just a design. It was deliberate, purposeful, but what it meant I couldn't say. That's when I noticed the smell. At first, I thought it was the heater kicking on. A faint, acrid odor like burnt oil. But the heater was off, and the smell grew stronger, filling the room with a metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. I checked the vents, the corners, even the bathroom, but nothing was out of place. Still, the smell lingered, and with it came a creeping unease. The next day, I went back into town, determined to dig deeper. Every conversation led to the same dead end. Sarah was quiet, Sarah was kind. Sarah wouldn't just run off. The townsfolk spoke in vague platitudes, but their eyes told a different story. At one point, I thought I saw someone following me. A man, dressed in a dark coat and hat, always just far enough away to blend into the background. When I turned to confront him, he was gone, like he'd never been there at all. That night at the motel, the burnt oil smell returned, stronger this time. I locked the door, pulled the curtains tight, and tried to ignore the way my own shadow seemed to flicker against the wall. I couldn't shake the feeling that Meadow Creek wasn't just hiding secrets. The town itself was a secret, and Sarah's disappearance was only the beginning. The road to the edge of the woods was little more than a dirt trail, flanked by dry grass and gnarled trees that clawed at the overcast sky. My car jostled over the uneven terrain, the sound of gravel crunching under the tires the only noise breaking the eerie silence. When I finally parked, a wall of ancient trees stood before me, their twisted branches intertwined like skeletal fingers. The woods had a weight to them, a stillness that pressed against my chest. No birds, no rustling leaves. Just silence so thick it was almost tangible. I should have turned back. Every instinct in me screamed to leave this place alone. But instinct doesn't pay the bills. I grabbed my notebook and flashlight, tucking them into my coat pocket before stepping onto the narrow path that cut into the forest. The air grew colder with every step, the faint scent of damp earth and decaying leaves rising around me. The deeper I went, the more the unease grew. My sixth sense wasn't just nudging me. It was roaring, the kind of gut-churning dread that made my hand hover near the amulet hanging from my neck. Every step felt heavier, the ground uneven and littered with roots that seemed to reach out like traps. About 20 minutes in, I found it. The makeshift altar was nestled in a small clearing, its presence jarring against the natural backdrop. A large, gnarled tree stump served as the centerpiece, its surface covered with an assortment of trinkets, rusted coins, animal bones, melted candles, and what looked like teeth. The sight alone was unsettling, but what made my stomach turn was the lantern glass scattered across the ground, shards of it glittering like cursed diamonds. I crouched down, careful not to disturb anything, and examined the scene. The lantern's base lay on its side, blackened and twisted as if it had been burned. The jagged edges of the broken glass caught the weak sunlight filtering through the canopy, reflecting faint rainbows that felt strangely wrong in this grim setting. That's when I saw the scarf. It was snagged on a low-hanging branch just a few feet away, fluttering slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. Faded blue, with delicate floral patterns, Sarah's scarf. I didn't need Edith to confirm it, but as I stepped closer, I saw the dark smear of mud and something else along its edge. Blood. I swallowed hard and pulled a handkerchief from my pocket, using it to carefully pull the scarf free. The fabric was damp, and the blood was dry but unmistakable. I held it up, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something move in the shadows beyond the clearing. A trick of the light? Maybe. Then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, like the murmur of wind through the leaves. But as I stood there, scarf in hand, they grew louder, more distinct. Dozens of voices, overlapping and urgent, speaking a language I couldn't understand. The sound pressed against my ears, rising and falling like a sinister tide. I turned in a slow circle, trying to pinpoint the source. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, bouncing off the trees and weaving through the air like a living thing. "Sarah," I called out, my voice sounding too loud, too sharp against the eerie quiet. The whispers stopped. The sudden silence was worse, pressed down on me, suffocating and absolute. I stood frozen, every muscle in my body taut, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then a faint crunch. I spun toward the sound, my hand instinctively going to my pocket where my notebook and flashlight were stashed. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a figure. Or at least I thought it was a figure. It was hard to tell in the shifting shadows. Tall, angular, and still. Too still. "Who's there?" I demanded, forcing steel into my voice. No response. The figure didn't move. I stepped forward, flashlight in hand, but as the beam cut through the gloom, the figure was gone. No sound of movement, no rustling leaves. Just empty space where it had been. I pocketed the scarf and glanced back at the altar, my gut twisting. Whatever happened here wasn't random. The trinkets, the broken lantern, it was all deliberate, ritualistic, and it wasn't just about Sarah. My sixth sense stirred again, stronger this time, sending a chill racing down my spine. It wasn't just fear. It was a warning. Something was watching me, something I couldn't see. The whispers started again, softer this time, but closer. I needed to leave. I backed out of the clearing, keeping my eyes on the altar as long as I could. The trees seemed darker now, the path harder to find. The whispers followed me, growing fainter the farther I went, until they faded completely. By the time I reached my car, the tension in my chest had eased, but the unease lingered. I sat behind the wheel, gripping the scarf in my lap, and stared at the forest line. Something happened to Sarah in those woods, something no one in Meadow Creek wanted to talk about. And whatever it was, it had left a scar on the town, on the forest, and maybe on me. I started the car, the engine's growl breaking the silence, and pulled away. The broken lantern, the bloodied scarf, the whispers. I'd seen enough to know this was more than just a missing persons case. Something dark was buried in those woods. And it wasn't done yet. The air in Mrs. Warren's parlor was thick with the scent of lavender and old wood. It wasn't a large room, but every surface was crowded with memories. Faded photographs in gilded frames, antique trinkets, and shelves weighed down by books that looked older than the town itself. In the center of it all sat Mrs. Warren, her frail hands clasped tightly around a steaming cup of tea. The scarf I'd found in the woods lay on the table between us, a silent witness to the conversation we were about to have. "You found this near the altar, didn't you?" she asked, her voice brittle but steady. "I don't know if I'd call it an altar," I replied. "But yeah, it was there, along with the lantern, or what's left of it." Mrs. Warren's face darkened, and her gaze dropped to the scarf. "I told you it was cursed," she said softly. "That lantern has always been a harbinger of sorrow for my family. And now, Sarah, curses aren't exactly my specialty," I said, leaning back in my chair. "But I'm listening." She looked up at me, her eyes clouded with both fear and resolve. "The lantern wasn't always ours," she began. "It once belonged to a man named Elias Blackthorne. Do you know the name?" I shook my head, though it tugged at something faint in the back of my mind. "He was an occultist," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "A sorcerer, they called him. A monster. He lived in Meadow Creek long before it was a proper town, back when it was just a scattering of farms and hunting cabins. People said he could command spirits, summon storms, and trap souls." I interrupted, raising an eyebrow. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes, that lantern. It wasn't just an object to him. It was a vessel. Prison. He used it to capture the souls of his victims and feed off their essence. Kept him young, powerful." I folded my arms, skeptical but intrigued. "And what happened to him?" "They executed him," she said simply. "The townsfolk finally rose up against him, dragged him to the edge of the woods, and hung him from the very tree where you found the altar." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, daring me to dismiss them. "And the lantern? They tried to destroy it," she said, her voice trembling now. "But it wouldn't burn. It wouldn't break. So they buried it, deep in the woods, and warned their children never to go looking for it. But my great-grandfather, he was a foolish man. He dug it up, thought it was just an old relic. He brought it into our home, and it's been in our family ever since." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. You're saying this thing is cursed? That it's tied to Blackthorn and... What? It's still trapping souls? Mrs. Warren nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Every generation, someone in my family suffers because of it. Tragedies, disappearances, deaths. And now Sarah. Her voice broke, and she covered her face with her hands. I sat back, letting the weight of her words settle. My logical mind wanted to dismiss the story as superstition, the kind of folklore small towns cling to. But my sixth sense was humming, a low, persistent vibration that told me there was something to her tale, something I couldn't ignore. That evening, I paid a visit to Meadow Creek's library. It was small and dusty, with a librarian who looked like she hadn't seen a visitor in weeks. She raised an eyebrow when I asked for records on Elias Blackthorn, but led me to a section of local history without a word. The trial records were buried in a stack of brittle, yellowed papers. I sat at a corner table, the dim light from a single bulb casting long shadows over the pages as I read. The account was chilling. Elias Blackthorn had been accused of witchcraft, murder, and unnatural acts. Witnesses described strange lights coming from his cabin at night, whispers that seemed to come from the trees, and livestock found dead with no visible wounds. But the most damning testimony came from those who claimed to have seen the lantern in action. One account described a woman who had confronted Blackthorn after her son went missing. She claimed to have seen the boy's face inside the lantern, his expression frozen in silent terror. The townsfolk believed her, and it wasn't long before they took justice into their own hands. The records detailed his execution in gruesome terms. They'd hung him, burned his body, and scattered the ashes. But there were whispers, unofficial accounts that said the lantern had glowed brightly even as Blackthorn died, and that his final words were a curse on the town and all who lived there. The last page mentioned a ritual, though the details were vague. It had something to do with binding the lantern's power, keeping it dormant. But over time, the specifics had been lost, or perhaps deliberately erased. As I left the library, the weight of what I'd read settled on my shoulders like a heavy coat. If the lantern was as dangerous as Mrs. Warren claimed, then Sarah's disappearance was no coincidence. The broken lantern, the altar, the whispers in the woods, it all pointed to something far darker than a runaway case. But there was one thing I couldn't shake. If Blackthorn was truly gone, why did it feel like he was still watching? That night, in the flickering light of my motel room, I sketched the lantern in my notebook. The details came easily, as if my hand already knew the shape. When I was done, I stared at the image, half expecting it to glow like the stories said. It didn't, but the faint smell of burnt oil lingered in the air, and I could have sworn I heard the faintest whisper. Cole. I didn't sleep much after that. I don't remember falling asleep that night, only that the exhaustion weighed on me like a lead blanket. The scratch of my pen on paper had been the last sound I heard, sketching the faint details of the lantern from memory. The motel's dim, flickering lamp cast long, jittery shadows, but I had been too tired to care. And then came the dream. It wasn't like other dreams, those fragmented bits of nonsense that slip away when you wake up. No, this felt real. Too real. I was standing in a space that had no beginning or end, a place where light and darkness fought for dominance. Thick fog coiled at my feet, damp and cold, and the air carried the faint metallic tang of burnt oil. I didn't know where I was, but I knew I wasn't alone. Sarah? The name echoed back to me, distorted, as if the fog itself had swallowed my voice and spat it out mangled. And then I saw her. She appeared slowly, as if the fog was reluctant to release her, her form wavering like a mirage. Sarah Warren. She looked just as she had in the photo Mrs. Warren had given me, young, wide-eyed, and vulnerable. But her smile was gone, replaced by an expression that made my stomach twist. Fear. Despair. Her hands were wrapped tightly around something. The lantern. It glowed faintly, its light flickering like a dying firefly, casting eerie shadows across Sarah's face. She moved her lips, mouthing words I couldn't hear, her eyes pleading, desperate. I tried to step closer, but my feet wouldn't obey. It felt like I was wading through molasses, the space around me thick and unyielding. Sarah. I called again, louder this time. What are you saying? I can't hear you. Her movements grew more frantic, her head shaking violently as if she was begging me to understand. Tears glistened on her cheeks, catching the lantern's dim light, and her free hand stretched toward me, trembling. Then the whispers started. They were soft at first, a distant hum that vibrated in the back of my skull, but they grew louder, overlapping, chaotic, until they filled the space with an unbearable cacophony. Sarah's mouth opened wide in a silent scream, and the lantern's glow flared, blinding and white-hot. When the light faded, Sarah was gone. I woke with a start, my chest heaving as if I'd just surfaced from drowning. The room was dark, save for the faint orange glow of the motel's neon sign filtering through the curtains. My heart was pounding, and sweat clung to my skin despite the chill in the air. For a moment, I thought it was just a nightmare, nothing more. But then I felt it. The amulet around my neck was warm, unnaturally so, as if it had been sitting in the sun. I yanked it out from under my shirt and held it in my palm, staring at the faint, pulsing glow that seemed to emanate from its center. What the hell? I muttered, my voice hoarse. That's when I noticed the notebook. It was open on the desk where I'd left it, but the page wasn't blank anymore. A new sketch had appeared, lines dark and deliberate, the ink still fresh. My breath caught in my throat as I leaned closer to examine it. The symbol. It was the same one I'd seen carved into Sarah's desk, but now it was more intricate, more alive. The jagged lines were sharper, more precise, and a circular pattern had emerged around the edges, creating something that resembled a gateway, or maybe a seal. The room felt colder now, the shadows on the walls deeper. I flipped through the pages, looking for any sign that I'd drawn it and forgotten, but there was nothing. No smudges, no pen marks on my hands, nothing to suggest I'd been the one holding the pen. Great, I muttered. Another mystery I didn't ask for. I closed the notebook and stood, pacing the room in an attempt to shake the unease clawing at my chest. My sixth sense was quiet now, but that didn't comfort me. If anything, the silence made it worse. The dream replayed in my mind, every detail vivid and sharp. Sarah's face, her desperation, the lantern in her hands. She'd been trying to tell me something important, and whatever it was, it had left its mark on me. I reached for the amulet again, the warmth now fading but still lingering like an echo. It had reacted to the dream, as if it had been trying to protect me, or warn me. The symbol in the notebook wasn't just a random design. I could feel it, deep in my gut. It was connected to the lantern, to Sarah, and maybe even to Blackthorn. But what it meant I didn't know. Not yet. I sat back down at the desk, staring at the notebook as if it might answer the questions swirling in my mind. The fog, the whispers, the light of the lantern. They all felt tied together, threads in a tapestry I couldn't yet see. One thing was clear, though, Sarah wasn't just missing. She was trapped. And if I didn't figure this out soon, I had a feeling she wouldn't be the only one. The room grew quiet again, the silence heavy and oppressive. I glanced at the notebook one last time before snapping it shut and reaching for the coffee pot on the nightstand. If I was going to unravel this mess, I needed answers. And sleep wasn't going to give me any. The diner wasn't much to look at. Cracked vinyl seats, sticky tabletops, and the faint hum of a jukebox that hadn't been updated since the 70s. But it was open late, and after a day of chasing dead ends, I needed something stronger than motel coffee to keep me going. The waitress, Nancy, brought me a cup of black coffee and a side of attitude, and I settled in at the counter, nursing the bitter brew as I sifted through my notes. That's when I noticed him. He sat alone in the far corner, hunched over a plate of fries that looked like they'd seen better days. His clothes were frayed, his beard uneven, and his skin had the weathered look of someone who'd spent more time outdoors than in. But it wasn't his appearance that caught my attention. It was the way he watched me, his eyes flicking to my notebook and then quickly away. I waited a beat, then closed the notebook with a soft snap. "Something on your mind, friend?" I called across the room, keeping my tone casual. The man hesitated, his fingers tightening around his fork. He looked like he was about to deny it, but then he sighed and gestured to the empty seat across from him. "You're asking about Sarah, aren't you?" I grabbed my coffee and joined him. Up close, he smelled like cigarettes and rain-soaked wool, a mix that wasn't entirely unpleasant. "What makes you think that?" I asked. "People don't come to Meadow Creek for the scenery," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Especially not with questions about the woods." "You seem to know a lot about it," I said, watching him carefully. "You got a name?" "Jonah," he said, not offering a hand. "Cole," I replied. "What do you know about Sarah?" Jonah glanced around the diner, as if checking to see if anyone was listening, then leaned in closer. "I've seen her," he said quietly. My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my expression neutral. "When?" "2 nights ago," he said. "Out in the woods, near the old stone circle." The mention of a stone circle sent a jolt through me. It matched the trial records I'd read about Elias Blackthorne and the ritual tied to his lantern. "She was walking," Jonah continued, his voice dropping lower. "But it wasn't normal. She looked like she was sleepwalking, clutching that damn lantern like it was the only thing keeping her alive. She didn't look at me, didn't say anything, just kept walking toward the circle." "Did you follow her?" I asked. Jonah shook his head sharply. "Hell no. You don't mess with that place. Not at night, not ever. And you sure as hell don't follow anyone carrying that lantern." "Why not?" He gave me a hard look, his bloodshot eyes narrowing. "Because anyone who crosses the lantern's path ends up cursed. Or worse." I leaned back in my seat, studying him. He wasn't lying, not outright, anyway. But there was something guarded about his tone, like he was holding back. "Cursed how?" I pressed. Jonah ran a hand through his greasy hair and sighed. "Look, I don't know all the details, all right? I just know the stories. People go into the woods chasing that light, and they don't come back. Or if they do, they're different. Changed." "Changed how?" "Like they're not really there," Jonah said. "Like their soul's been scooped out and something else is wearing their skin." I frowned, my gut twisting. "And you're sure it was Sarah?" Jonah nodded. "I've seen her picture around town. Same girl. But if you're smart, you'll leave this alone. Whatever's got her, it's not something you can fight." I took a sip of my coffee, letting his words sink in. My sixth sense wasn't giving me much, but it didn't need to. The tension in Jonah's voice, the way he glanced at the window like he expected something to be watching, it all painted a clear picture. He was scared. "You seem to know a lot about the woods, Jonah," I said. "Why's that?" He stiffened, his fingers drumming against the table. "Let's just say I've been around long enough to know what's safe and what isn't." "Long enough to know where this stone circle is?" I asked. Jonah's jaw tightened. "You don't want to go there." "Maybe not," I said, pulling out my notebook and flipping to the page with the symbol I'd seen in Sarah's room. "But I don't have much of a choice." His eyes flicked to the drawing, and I caught the faintest flicker of recognition before he masked it. "You've seen this before," I said, my voice firm. "Haven't you?" Jonah didn't answer. Instead, he shoved his plate aside and stood abruptly, grabbing his coat. "You don't want to know what's out there," he muttered. "Maybe not," I said, standing to block his path. "But I need to find Sarah, and you're the first person who's given me anything useful. So either you tell me what you know, or I'll find my own way to that circle." For a moment, I thought he might push past me and leave. But then he sighed and sat back down, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Fine," he said. "I'll show you. But if you go out there and things go sideways, don't say I didn't warn you." He drained the last of his coffee, threw a crumpled bill on the table, and walked out. I followed him into the damp night, the cold air biting at my skin. As we headed toward the edge of town, I couldn't shake the feeling that Jonah knew more than he was letting on. And the way his eyes darted to the shadows, it made me wonder if he was afraid of the lantern, or something worse. The forest was darker than it should have been. Jonah and I moved through the trees in silence, the faint beam of my flashlight cutting a narrow path through the oppressive black. The air smelled of damp earth and something faintly metallic, a tang that reminded me of blood. Even the wind seemed afraid to disturb the stillness, leaving the woods eerily silent save for the crunch of our footsteps. "You're sure it's this way?" I asked, glancing back at Jonah. He nodded, his face pale and drawn. "It's not far now," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You'll feel it before you see it." Feel it. That part, at least, I believed. With every step closer, the weight in the air grew heavier, pressing down on my chest like a phantom hand. My sixth sense hummed at the edge of my awareness, a low, insistent warning that made the hair on my neck stand on end. "Why are you helping me?" I asked, more to fill the silence than anything else. Jonah didn't answer right away. His gaze darted nervously between the trees, and when he finally spoke, his voice cracked. "Because I don't want to be the only one who knows what's out here." Comforting. When we finally reached the clearing, I stopped dead in my tracks. The stone circle was ancient, the kind of thing that felt older than time itself. Rough-hewn monoliths jutted from the ground at odd angles, weathered and cracked but still standing tall like sentinels. Moss clung to their surfaces, and the faint outlines of carvings, symbols I didn't recognize, peeked through the grime. At the center of the circle stood a tree, if you could still call it that. The trunk was rotted and blackened, its branches gnarled and twisted like claws reaching for the sky. The bark was etched with deep grooves, shapes that matched the symbol from Sarah's desk and my notebook. And hanging from one of those branches, swaying gently despite the still air, was the lantern. It looked impossibly old, its metal frame tarnished and cracked, the glass warped like it had been exposed to fire. But it wasn't broken. A faint, pulsing glow emanated from within, barely strong enough to light the space around it but enough to make the shadows seem alive. Jonah stopped a few paces behind me. "That's it," he said, his voice trembling. "That's the circle." I took a cautious step closer, the weight in the air growing thicker, heavier. My sixth sense screamed at me to stop, to turn around, but I ignored it. The whispers started again. At first, they were faint, just a murmur at the edge of hearing. But as I approached the tree, they grew louder, overlapping voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The words were indistinct, spoken in a language I couldn't understand, but their tone was unmistakable. Pleading, angry, accusing. "Do you hear that?" I asked Jonah, not looking back. "I hear it," he said, his voice barely audible. "It's them. The souls he took. The ones trapped in the lantern." I stopped a few feet from the tree, the whispers now deafening, like a storm raging just behind my ears. The lantern swayed slightly, its glow intensifying, and for a moment, I thought I saw someone in the glass. Sarah. Her face flickered like a bad signal on an old TV, her expression frozen in despair. She reached out, her mouth moving as if she were screaming, but no sound came through. Behind her, other faces appeared. Dozens, maybe hundreds, their features twisted in agony, their eyes hollow and lifeless. "Sarah!" I shouted, taking another step forward. The light from the lantern flared, blinding and white-hot, forcing me to shield my eyes. When it dimmed again, the visions were gone, replaced by a shadowy figure standing just beyond the tree. Elias Blackthorne. I didn't need an introduction to know it was him. His form was indistinct, more smoke than flesh, but his eyes burned with an unnatural fire. He stood tall, his head tilted as if sizing me up, and though he didn't speak, I felt his presence like a hand around my throat. "What do you want?" I demanded, though my voice cracked. The whispers answered, rising into a cacophony that drowned out my thoughts. The lantern's glow pulsed in time with the noise, brighter and brighter until it felt like the entire clearing was alive with its light. That's when Jonah broke. "I told you we shouldn't be here," he shouted, backing away. "This place isn't for us." "Jonah, wait!" But he was already running, disappearing into the trees without a backward glance. And then there was silence. The whispers stopped as suddenly as they'd started, leaving me alone in the clearing with the lantern and the shadow of Elias Blackthorne. The air was thick with tension, every breath a struggle. The lantern's glow shifted, its light deepening into an ominous red, and I felt something shift in the ground beneath my feet. The carvings on the tree began to writhe, the symbols moving as if alive. I reached for the amulet around my neck, its warmth a small comfort in the oppressive cold. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't just about Sarah. It was bigger than her, bigger than Blackthorn. But she was still trapped in that lantern, and I wasn't leaving without her. "All right," I said, gripping the amulet tightly. "Let's see what you've got." The lantern flared again, and the shadows began to move. The world fractured around me as the lantern's glow pulsed one last time. It wasn't like the blinding flashes before. This was different. It swallowed the clearing hole, the stone circle, the gnarled tree, even the whispering woods. All of it folded into the light, until there was nothing but an endless void. And then I was falling. The sensation was sharp, my stomach lurching as though I'd been yanked from solid ground and tossed into the abyss. Shadows clawed at me from every direction, their inky tendrils curling and unfurling like living things. Voices whispered, no, screamed. In 1,000 languages, the sound digging into my skull. When I landed, it wasn't on anything solid. The ground beneath me felt alive, shifting and pulsing, a grotesque mirror of flesh and shadow. The air was heavy, thick with the acrid stench of burnt oil and sulfur. And there she was, Sarah. She was trapped inside the lantern, her face pressed against its warped glass. Her eyes, wide and terrified, searched for something I realized, as her gaze locked onto mine. Her lips moved in desperate silence, her hands pounding weakly against the barrier that held her. "Sarah!" I shouted, my voice reverberating in the twisted space. I ran toward her, but the shadows surged to block my path. They rose like walls, shimmering and shifting, their forms flickering with the faintest outlines of faces. I stumbled back, instinctively clutching the amulet around my neck. "Persistent, aren't you?" The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a deep, guttural sound that sent ice through my veins. Slowly, a figure emerged from the darkness, a man or what was left of one. Elias Blackthorn. His form was grotesque, a shifting amalgamation of flesh, shadow, and rot. His face was a distortion of human features. Sunken eyes that burned like embers, a mouth stretched into a cruel smile, and hands that were more claws than fingers. He moved like smoke, his body never quite solid, as if reality itself was trying to reject him. "You've come far for a dead girl," he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "But you're too late. She's not dead," I snapped, stepping forward despite the oppressive weight in the air. "And you're not keeping her." Blackthorn chuckled, a sound that felt like nails scraping against bone. Bold words for a man standing in my domain. "Tell me, detective, what makes you think you'll succeed where so many others have failed?" I didn't answer. Instead, I tightened my grip on the amulet, its warmth steadying me against the icy dread that radiated from him. "Ah," Blackthorn said, his fiery eyes narrowing. "That little trinket. I can feel its power, you know. A relic, yes, but no match for me." He stepped closer, his voice lowering to a taunting whisper. "But you could leave. Walk away and I'll let you go. You have my word." "Your word doesn't mean much to me," I shot back. He tilted his head, the grotesque smile widening. "Oh, but I mean it. Walk away now and I'll spare you. No shadows will follow you home, no whispers in the dark. Leave the girl and live." I glanced at Sarah, her face pale, her movements slowing as the lantern's light pulsed around her. She was fading. Whatever Blackthorn had done, whatever power he was using, it was draining her soul, binding her to this hellish plane. "No deal," I said, my voice firm. Blackthorn's smile disappeared, replaced by a snarl. "Then you'll die with her." The shadows surged toward me, a tidal wave of darkness and teeth. I dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the first strike, and scrambled to pull my notebook from my coat. My hands moved on instinct, flipping to the page with the symbol I'd sketched. The gateway. I didn't fully understand it, but I knew it was the key. My gut told me so, And in my line of work, instincts were as good as gold. Blackthorn loomed above me, his form stretching into impossible shapes. "You think scribbles will save you?" he hissed, his voice like grinding stone. "They've gotten me this far," I muttered, tearing the page free and holding it up. The amulet around my neck flared to life, its heat surging through me like liquid fire. The symbol on the page began to glow, the lines burning with a brilliant light that cut through the shadows. Blackthorn recoiled, his form twisting as the light struck him. "No!" he roared, his voice shaking the air. "You don't know what you're doing." "Maybe not," I said, pushing myself to my feet. "But I'm learning fast." I stepped closer to the lantern, the glowing page held high, the amulet's warmth guiding me. The shadows lashed out, but they couldn't touch me, repelled by the light that now surrounded me like a shield. Blackthorn howled, his form unraveling, but he wasn't done yet. He surged toward the lantern, his claws reaching for Sarah. "Not this time," I growled. With a burst of strength, I pressed the glowing page against the lantern's glass. The light exploded outward, brighter than anything I'd ever seen, flooding the space with a purifying brilliance. Blackthorn screamed, his form disintegrating into wisps of smoke. The shadows writhed and vanished, and the oppressive weight lifted. When the light faded, the lantern was shattered, its pieces scattered across the ground. Sarah lay where it had been, her chest rising and falling as she gasped for air. I dropped to my knees beside her, exhaustion washing over me like a wave. But I didn't care. She was alive. And Blackthorn? He was gone. For now. The shattered remnants of the lantern lay at my feet, glinting faintly in the eerie half-light of the clearing. The oppressive energy that had hung over the stone circle moments ago was gone, evaporating like morning mist. For the first time since I'd stepped into these cursed woods, the air felt breathable. But silence is its own kind of weight. I knelt beside Sarah, who was slumped on the ground where the lantern had once hung. Her breaths were shallow, her face pale and streaked with grime, but she was alive. The weak rise and fall of her chest was enough to pull a breath of relief from my own lungs. "You're okay?" I murmured, gently shaking her shoulder. Her eyelids fluttered, but her gaze remained unfocused, distant. "Sarah," I repeated louder this time, "can you hear me?" Her lips parted, a faint whisper escaping. A single syllable I couldn't make out. I leaned closer, straining to hear, but the sound was drowned by the memory of the whispers that had filled the space only minutes ago. The other souls. I turned back to the fragments of the lantern. The glass shimmered unnaturally, as if it still held echoes of the power it had once contained. In the dim reflection, faces flickered, ghostly, faint, and fleeting. The victims of Elias Blackthorn. Their eyes, hollow with torment, met mine for a fleeting moment before disappearing entirely, leaving only cold shards of ordinary glass. "You're free," I whispered. "It's over." But even as I said the words, I felt the lie behind them. The forest was still. Too still. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, just the hollow silence that followed the storm. I pulled Sarah to her feet, looping her arm over my shoulder. She was weak, her legs trembling, but her weight was manageable. "Come on," I muttered, more to myself than to her. "Let's get out of here." The path back to town felt longer this time, the shadows deeper, the trees taller. Every crunch of a leaf beneath my boots felt like a gunshot in the quiet, and with each step, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. My sixth sense wasn't screaming at me anymore, but it wasn't silent either. The curse wasn't entirely gone. I felt it in the back of my mind, a faint hum that refused to dissipate. It wasn't the same oppressive energy I'd felt in the clearing. It was subtler, quieter, like a needle resting just beneath the skin. "Cole!" Sarah rasped suddenly, her voice hoarse. I stopped in my tracks, turning to look at her. Her eyes were clearer now, though still shadowed with exhaustion. "What is it?" I asked. She struggled to speak, her words barely audible. "He's not gone." A chill ran through me, colder than the night air. Blackthorn, She nodded weakly, her grip tightening on my arm. He said, "You can't kill what's already dead." I swallowed hard, my thoughts racing. I didn't doubt her. Couldn't, not after everything I'd seen. The lantern was destroyed, the souls freed, but Elias Blackthorne wasn't bound by the same rules as the rest of us. He was something else, something worse. I shook my head, forcing myself to focus. "We'll deal with him," I said, though the words felt hollow. "For now, let's just get you somewhere safe." Meadow Creek came into view just as the first hints of dawn broke over the horizon. The town looked as weary as I felt, its streets bathed in a pale, gray light that did little to chase away the shadows. Mrs. Warren's house was dark when we arrived, the porch light flickering faintly. I helped Sarah to the door and knocked. It took only seconds for the old woman to answer, her eyes widening in disbelief as she saw her granddaughter leaning heavily against me. "Sarah!" she cried, pulling her into a trembling embrace. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched the girl tightly, murmuring words of gratitude I couldn't fully process. I stepped back, giving them space, but my mind wasn't here anymore. It was back in the woods, in the clearing, in the fractured reality where I'd faced Blackthorne. His words lingered in my mind, a shadow that refused to fade. I didn't stay long. After ensuring Sarah was settled, I left the house with little fanfare. Mrs. Warren had tried to offer me payment, her gratitude spilling over in trembling words, but I waved it off. The job wasn't done. Not really. I found myself standing outside my motel room, staring at the door as if it held answers. The hum in my mind was stronger now, like a whisper just out of reach. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the scent of burnt oil faint but unmistakable. On the desk, my notebook lay open, though I didn't remember leaving it that way. The symbol I'd drawn, the gateway, was there, but it had changed. The lines were sharper, more intricate, almost alive. And beneath it, a single word had appeared, scrawled in handwriting that wasn't mine. "Soon." I stared at it for a long time, my grip tightening on the amulet around my neck. The warmth that had comforted me before was gone now, replaced by a cold weight that settled deep in my chest. Blackthorne might be gone for now, but the curse wasn't broken. Not completely. And as I sank into the creaking chair, my eyes on the word in my notebook, I realized something else. The fight against Blackthorne wasn't just his fight. It was mine too. Because somewhere in the darkness, my own demons were waiting, and they weren't going to stay quiet for long.